So thanks very much, Bansi. These are essentially slides that I've prepared since last night. So uh, this is not really a research project at this stage, but it's just an attempt to put together my thoughts based on what I've been reading around COVID-19 and specifically what I've been reading in policy briefs about um, the potential effects on adolescent girls. So there are lots of organizations which have identified adolescent girls as being in a potential risk group. And I wanted to understand better what are the arguments behind that claim, and what does the existing evidence say? Just to give a bit of context, the reason that I think that this is important in the case of South Asia is because in South Asia there are high rates of school dropout among adolescent girls. So for example, in India, it's about 40% of girls who finish secondary school. In Bangladesh, it's about 25%. And so a lot of these girls drop out of secondary school in their adolescence. And there's also a high incidence of marriage in adolescence. So almost 60% in Bangladesh, 25% in India, 45% in Nepal. And a lot of these marriages are taking place below the legal minimum age, which is 18 in India and Bangladesh. And it's 20 years in Nepal. And typically these two effects are, these two outcomes are very highly correlated, that when in countries and regions where you see high secondary school dropout among girls, you see also a high incidence of early marriage. So I have tried to put together some potential mechanisms as to why COVID-19 and the lockdowns might pose a threat for adolescent girls in the form of early school dropout or early marriage. And this is the kind of mechanism that I could think of based on what I've seen being written in various policy documents and what's known from the literature. So secondary schools are thought to provide some sort of social protection for adolescent girls, independently of the teaching and the skills that they provide. So for example, because these are societies in which adolescent girls can be pressured or forced into early marriage by their households, teachers and classmates can constitute a kind of a monitoring mechanism in the sense that if a girl stops coming to school, then they can make inquiries in the community and inform relevant authorities if it turns out the girl is being pressured or forced into early marriage. And if this is an important mechanism, and there are lots of news articles which have been written about this, then it means that while schools are closed during the lockdown, this monitoring mechanism is no longer effective. And so the question is, do these girls therefore face an increased risk of early or forced marriage while schools are closed? So that's one potential channel through which there might be some risks in the present situation. And then, of course, there is this very large literature which shows that women and girls suffer the brunt of adverse economic shocks in developing countries, and that there is very little risk sharing happening during, so very little risk sharing happening within households during severe economic shocks. And of course, these lockdowns in these countries constitute a very severe economic shock for households which have lost their livelihoods as a result. And so that's another way in which you might see a large effect on adolescent girls. And specifically, it could be that school dropout and early marriage of girls forms a part of a risk coping strategy for the household, as a way of reducing the economic burden of the household, sending an adolescent girl away as a consequence of a marriage. But there is existing evidence which suggests that the opposite might happen in South Asia. And in particular, I'm thinking about this paper by Corno, Hildebrand, and Buena, which look at how droughts affects marriage timing. And they do this for sub-Saharan Africa and in India. And they find opposite effects in these two regions, in the sense that droughts increase the risk of early marriage in sub-Saharan Africa, but they reduce the risk of early marriage in India. And the explanation they put forward is that in regions where bride price is prevalent, marrying off a daughter means that you get that bride price, and marrying her off early means that you get that bride price in advance. And so therefore, that is a way in which you could try to deal with an economic shock. But if the marriage institution involves dowry payments, then marrying off a daughter is expensive. And so you would want to postpone those dowry payments during an economic shock. And therefore you would want to, you might actually want to postpone the marriage as a way of dealing with the crisis. And so therefore, in the current situation, given that in South Asia, dowry payments are prevalent, we don't really see bride price payments going around at the current time. What can potentially happen if we think in terms of this mechanism is that the shock is going to delay marriages in South Asia. A third mechanism that that I've heard being mentioned is something along the following lines: that the care responsibilities within households, which are borne typically by women and girls, are going to increase during the lockdown, because they need to take care of household members who may have fallen ill, because they have to maintain higher hygiene standards during the pandemic, and that responsibility typically falls on women and girls. As a result of that, adolescent girls are more likely to be pulled into that kind of household work while schools are closed. And that kind of household work might be necessary even after schools have reopened. And so that means the opportunity cost of female schooling is going to rise as a result of this lockdown, which can increase the chances of female school dropout. And in this context, I wanted to mention this recent paper by Adams and Andrew, who use discrete choice experiments to estimate the returns to education for girls using a sample of households in Rajasthan. And what they find is that all the perceived returns to female education, so what parents believe the returns to female education to be, are driven entirely by the perceived returns on the marriage market. So in the sense that there's a perception that if girls are better educated, then that will increase their prospects of the marriage market. But controlling for the match on the marriage market, the perceived returns to education are actually close to zero. And if that's a situation which is prevalent in South Asia, then you just need an increase in the opportunity cost of female schooling um, for girls to be taken out of school. If there is no perception of this education having returns in the labor market. And in particular, one possible scenario which could arise in the current situation is that adolescent girls could be taken out of school so that they can provide care at home, and a marriage might be arranged for them during the lockdown period. Um, the marriage itself might be postponed so that they can continue providing care at home till a later point where the crisis has been, when the crisis is over. Um, and the reason why that might be a possible scenario is that once a match has been made, according to the study by Adams and Andrew, for example, there are no further perceived returns to female education in these households. So that's another potential mechanism which could be at play in the current situation. There's also a literature which has looked at the effects of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa on adolescent girls and their schooling. And I think this is an interesting comparison to make, because a lot of the policies which were implemented during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa were actually quite similar. So they involved village lockdowns, travel bans, extended school closures, economic activities being limited during the lockdown, and so on. And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence from various organizations which work with adolescent girls of there being an increase in child labor, in teenage pregnancies. And so this quote is from a study by the UNICEF, which says that in Sierra Leone, teenage pregnancies doubled as a result of the outbreak. So, although there is a lot of anecdotal evidence, there isn't a lot in the form of rigorous studies of the effects of the Ebola outbreak. But one such study that I found is this one by Bandiera and others, who were conducting this intervention on skills training for adolescent girls and young women in Sierra Leone. They had conducted their baseline survey just before the Ebola outbreak happened, and these places went into lockdown. And then they did their intervention during the lockdown. And what they were able to show using the baseline data and using variation in the extent of disruption which occurred in these villages in Sierra Leone is that in the villages which were most severely hit by the Ebola outbreak, there was a drop in enrollment rates among adolescent girls by 16 percentage points, which is about a third below the baseline enrollment rate. And that this effect persisted long after schools reopened. So it's not just that they're staying out of school during the lockdown, but there's a persistence of this effect even after schools reopen. And they also find that this effect of the lockdown during the Ebola outbreak on school enrollment by adolescent girls was mitigated by their intervention, which was providing skills training to adolescent girls, and it in fact reduced the dropout rate by half, so from 16 percentage points to 8 percentage points. So these patterns from the Ebola outbreak, I think, are interesting to keep in mind when thinking about the current context. So that's really what I had to say at the current time. The things that I think are that it would be interesting to have ideas about or discussions around are what kind of data collection exercise would be fruitful in the current situation if we want to shed light on what is happening to adolescent girls in South Asia as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is not an obvious question to answer because, for example, if we think in terms of conducting household surveys, conducting telephone surveys to understand what might be happening, the picture that we're going to get at the present time is that we're going to find that girls as well as boys are not in school, that they're helping out at home. But that's not going to give us the full picture of what might happen once schools reopen, whether this is some sort of temporary effect or it's going to have long-term consequences. Another kind of data collection that researchers can engage in at the moment is to monitor what is happening in terms of calls to helplines, which have been set up specifically to provide support or advice to those who are at risk of early marriage or forced marriage in these countries. It's also possible to collect data on school attendance when schools reopen, but that might be, if data collection occurs at that point, that might be too late already to take any kind of action, which might be to intervene at that moment from a policy perspective. So I think it's not an easy question to address in terms of what we as researchers could do given the risks posed, and in trying to understand what is actually happening. And so any suggestions that you have on these questions are I think it would be nice to discuss. So yes, that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Zaki. So there are a few questions. Amrit, would you like to ask yours first, please?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned the paper by Corneau et al., which talked about how in places that practice dowries, a reduction, an adverse economic shock actually reduces marriages. Does that sort of require that there's price stickiness in the price of brides? And if not, why don't dowries adjust downward to clear the market?
So that's a good question. I don't know how they and whether they account for the fact that prices might change as a result of an economic shock. So yes, I would need to think about that and look at their paper to see how they deal with that. I'll think about that.
Okay, thank you. Bansi, please, your question.
So I actually had a couple of questions and further thoughts that I can share later. So the first question is just around, should we also be thinking about the effect of the lockdown on other aspects of the marriage market, things like the search cost for a marriage partner, and would that also not affect the likelihood of could it not dampen the likelihood of an early marriage? The second thing is, in a way, some of these effects, as you see in this slide here, is that they might not become apparent until quite late on. Things, dropouts, early marriage. There is another narrative in South Asia, especially in India, about girls, once they're dropped out, families want to protect their purity, so that's why they start thinking, oh, let's marry them off. that could also be affected by the lockdown. And so in a way, it's, thinking of the sort of data collection and so on, maybe want to first currently track what adolescent girls are doing. How is their time being used?
Okay.
Are they being, I expect very little of this, but, is there any sort of homeschooling that they're getting from the schools? And is this something that could be intervened on even quite soon? Perhaps that's the way to go. So I think I've said a few things, so I'll stop here.
Okay. So in terms of marriage search costs, my impression is that most matchmaking that would occur in India or Bangladesh today would be done via mobile phones. I mean, there isn't a lot of traveling involved. And so, of course, there are certain kinds of events around matchmaking and marriages which can't take place in a lockdown situation. But there are lots of other things which can happen. A lot of the search-related process can happen because they don't really require face-to-face contact. And so I think while there might be an effect on the process itself, the marriage process itself might be delayed. The search costs might not be affected so much because they don't require really moving around physically. But I think that's something which is an important question to address as well. So I think, yes, it is worthwhile collecting time use data. And I know that there is this study the Population Council is doing, which is trying to collect time use data on adolescent girls in Bangladesh. I've heard policy discussions around, whether how homeschooling can be supported. And a lot of that discussion quickly turns out to the point that if this homeschooling support is going to be given via the internet, through digital technology, then that's going to open up a digital divide between poor households and richer households. I've heard the Bangladesh government suggesting homeschooling support through radio broadcasts, which they used to do, 30 or 40 years ago. But I think that those kinds of interventions, so my own pessimistic view is that those kinds of interventions might have just a second order effect compared to the first order effect which comes from the increase in responsibilities that these girls might have at home during the lockdown, or the effects of an adverse economic shock, which might increase or decrease the risk of early marriage. Because I'm not sure to what extent homeschooling would, or providing support for homeschooling would affect these other factors which are going to play a major role in household decisions. But yeah, but I should say that yes, time use data seems like an important thing to be able to collect in the present situation.
Okay, thank you. Irma and Adelina have comments, but I think we could move on to Rohini because she has a suggestion to give. So please, Rohini, if you could.
Oh, yeah, Zaki, I just had an idea. which is, I think if you didn't push the telephone interview stuff, sorry, I'm moving around. The DHS, we found was pretty good to figure out delays in marriage ages. And my guess is that pretty soon after the pandemic is over, because there is one due in India. I don't know about Bangladesh and other countries. But it's really pretty good because it looks at all the girls who are living home. So we've used it to look at the scheme in Haryana, Apni Beti Apna Dhan. And we find effects very close to the age of 18. So we don't find it delays marriage very much, but it does just a little bit because they get a transfer when they turn 18. And so I would suggest looking carefully at the DHS. We've really gone into the primary data collection mode in development. And sometimes we just miss the value of these surveys, because the advantage of that is, like Sabya is looking across countries, you could actually look across different countries with DHS surveys. So that was my only thought.
Okay.
And also I wanted to say one thing on Amrit's question, because I thought that was very good, on the price versus the price shock, the price response. And I think that you might want to explore that a bit. I think that if the shock is very big relative to the change in prices, then you might expect that the quantity effect will still work in your direction. If the price effect was really big, then you might think, oh, dowries are low, and so let's get them married. My guess is that price effects are small. I don't know that in this case. But one of the things that's really surprised us when we've looked at other disasters like floods is prices tend to change very little. The quantity response, so people get unemployed, but their wages hardly ever decline. And so that's an interesting theoretical question, and it would be an interesting empirical finding. So that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for the suggestions. So on the DHS, so what you're suggesting, Rohini, so that would involve waiting till the new rounds of the DHS become available during or after the lockdown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you could start doing stuff now, but if you're interested in the general question, because I think it's a good one, then just keep an eye out for those rounds and use them. And you could compare multiple rounds in the same country.
Right. Yeah.
There was one due in India just this year, which hasn't happened. And so my guess is it'll happen pretty soon after the pandemic the effects of the pandemic, whenever it's safe to go out and survey people.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anirban, you have a question, please.
Yes, so it's more like a thought. So, clearly during the lockdown, a lot of marriages which were planned, they're not happening, right? So post-lockdown, there's going to be a spike in total marriages anyway, right? And these would include not just underage marriage. So I think what the key variable to focus on is probably the proportion of underage marriages. I mean, I don't know how to disentangle that from the entire marriage.
So I think that's an interesting point, that just because weddings can't take place during the lockdown, that should have an effect on increasing the marriage age. So yes, there is a mechanical effect which is going to take place. I suppose an important indicator is going to be, well, how many of these girls return to school after the lockdown.
Correct.
and yes, whether the marriage rate over this whole period, pre to post lockdown, is higher than it would be under normal circumstances in different years.
I mean, there's a related point. I mean, at least in India, weddings are expensive affairs. I mean, across the income spectrum. So, because it's a negative economic shock, people would delay the marriage because they need to get the requisite amount of money for spending at the wedding. I don't know whether that would apply to Bangladesh, but in India, it's certainly the case that you tend to spend a significant fraction of your income.
Yeah. And that should go in the same direction as dowry. Yeah, that if you by delaying the marriage, but you are postponing that expense.